Welcome to Catholic Comments. I'm Wendy M. Wright.
And I'm John O'Keefe. Our guest today is Tracy Leavelle, who is Associate Professor of History and Associate Dean for Humanities and Fine Arts here at Creighton University. He's also a frequent guest on our program. We're here today to talk about Isaac Jogues and Jean de Brebeuf, two of the North American Martyrs. Welcome back, Tracy.
I'm very happy to be here. Glad to be back.
We're glad to have you back. I attend St. John's Church on Creighton University campus, and I happen to, of course, Creighton is a Jesuit university, and I happen to sit in a spot often that allows me to look up at some wonderful stained glass windows in the church that memorialize the Jesuit martyrs of North America. And these two men have a memorial coming up on the liturgical calendar, and maybe you could tell us who they were and why they were martyred and why we remember them.
Well, where to begin? I guess that's really the question. They are among the 8 North American martyrs, so 8 Jesuits who were canonized by Pope Pius XI in 1930. They're probably the 2 most famous of the 8 for a couple of reasons. One, Brebeuf was recognized even in his own lifetime as a very holy person and someone that could potentially go down the path toward sainthood. And Isaac Jogues became very well known because he was physically tortured by Native Americans in what is today New York, the Iroquois, and lost fingers and was sent back to France. He was captured, sent back to France, and then actually returned to continue his mission where he was martyred. So they both have very compelling
and they're both
stories.
They're both French.
They're both French Jesuits. Yes.
And tell us the approximate dates so we can put this in situation.
We're in the 1640s.
1640s, okay. So this is the colonization of northern Canada and what we think of as the United States today by the French, and the Jesuits sent these men. Why would they send them? And besides the fact that they were martyred for their faith, can you tell us a little about their stories?
Yeah, they were an important part of the French colonial process in New France, and the Jesuits had the biggest influence among the missionaries in that region. There were some orders of nuns that worked in the communities, like Quebec and Montreal, but it was the Jesuits who did most of the work out in the native communities, and they were particularly active among the Hurons or the Wendats, and that mission is very well known, and that was the mission that Brebeuf dedicated his life to. And Jogues and others tried to extend the mission to the Iroquois. And one of the interesting things that happened was the Iroquois and the Hurons were really bitter enemies, and so the Jesuits got involved in this conflict.
And so the Iroquois were in what's now New York?
Yes.
And so they were really based up in what's now Canada. Would that be right? Or
The Hurons?
No, the Martyrs, the
Martyrs.
Jogues and
yeah.
Brebeuf.
So they were based in the St. Lawrence River Valley. Quebec was a primary center. The Hurons were on Georgian Bay in Lake Huron, in a pretty concentrated set of communities there. And the Iroquois were in what is today upstate New York, western New York. And this was a real zone of conflict that the Jesuits entered.
Between the Iroquois and the Hurons.
Yes,
right.
and they were trying to work simultaneously in both communities.
So was their
which
martyrdom
creates
then tied to the perception of taking sides, or that they got caught up in the conflict between the Iroquois and the Hurons?
Yeah, it is tied to that larger, really complex story about intertribal conflict between the Iroquois and the Hurons and other. It was set off by a lot of things. I mean, there were internal, it was internal native politics, competition between native communities, and then with the French entry and the entry of the Dutch and then the English in the Hudson River Valley, it was a really difficult and unstable time period.
Right. Well, today we look back, I think a lot of us don't necessarily think about the French or New France, but certainly in the United States we have a somewhat guarded and ambivalent view of a colonization and what happened to the native peoples. Can you tell us a little about this particular or those particular missions, Brebeuf and Jogues?
Well, the mission to the Hurons was considered by the French Jesuits at the time their great success. It was not perfect by any means, and there's even today among historians there's a lot of controversy over how to interpret properly what happened. They were suffering from the effects of population decline due to disease and constant warfare, but there were clearly some conversions to Catholicism led by the Jesuits. They were less successful among the Iroquois.
Right.
And it was much more difficult and controversial within Iroquois communities. So the Iroquois who tended to adopt Catholicism, they tended to leave the community. So the most famous one being Kateri Tekakwitha, who is now, the Mohawk saint.
Right.
Herself. She had to leave the community to be a practicing Catholic.
Right. So what were these communities like, in, let's say, among the Huron, the more successful of these colonies? Again, we know something about the Jesuit missions in South America, and we certainly know something about the Franciscan missions in California, and some unhappy
how do
stories,
we know what we know? I mean, what kind of records survive from this period?
Jesuits are great because they wrote a lot. Ignatius, from the founding of the Society of Jesus, insisted that the Jesuits out in the field write back to their superiors, and that the superiors wrote to the general. So one of the great things about the Jesuits for historians is they left amazing records. And these records are easily available in the Jesuit Relations, which in the Jesuit missions in New France, the Jesuits decided for a variety of reasons, including for promotional reasons, to start publishing accounts of their activity in New France through a press in Paris. This is to raise money, to raise awareness of their work. So these are excellent sources, and they're widely available in French and translated into English. So there's great material there.
So what do they tell us about actually, besides, somehow people got converted, what did they have missions that they established the way it happened in California?
So at first, the first idea was that they would have these reductions similar. I mean, they were definitely aware of what had happened in South America and places like Paraguay. And they thought that the reduction method might work, and it just didn't. It wasn't very successful at all. It was a failed experiment. So they quickly decided that the best way to work was to go out into the native communities themselves, establish the missions, learn the native languages, and work, out there. And the Hurons were a very settled community, relatively densely populated, agriculturally oriented, very invested in trade networks that extended throughout the region. So they were interested in, for reasons of trade and alliance with relations with the French.
Okay.
So they kind of allowed the Jesuits to be there. They tolerated them.
Okay.
But what actually sort of went wrong then, and that resulted in their martyrdom, besides being caught up in the
especially with Brebeuf.
Yeah, and how did they die? I mean, what are the circumstances of
it was the Iroquois attack. So so Brebeuf was killed in the Huron missions. Jogues was killed in the Iroquois mission in New York. So Jogues had come back, determined to try to complete his work, even though he had survived captivity and torture, and was killed in New York. So it was part of that conflict between the Hurons and the Iroquois. And the Iroquois essentially destroyed the Hurons as a stable community in that region, absorbing some of them as captives and in a process of repopulation, and destroying the missions in 1649 and dispersing the surviving Wendettes to other communities.
So Brebeuf then died in that conflict.
Yes.
Right. So.
I feel like I can't have you on the show without bringing up the issue of colonialism, and every time you've come on, we've talked about it, and
Yes.
so I'm not presuming that our listeners have heard the other programs, but there is that. Whenever you're talking about Christian mission associated with colonialism, there's that ambiguity that goes with that. And so how do you think about their martyrdom in the context of the colonial project they were about?
That's a really great question. I don't think you can disentangle the missions from the larger colonial project, even though the Jesuits, in this case and in other cases as well, were not always in alignment with the other colonial officials and colonial projects.
The more political and
right.
military groups. Yeah.
So they were highly critical sometimes of what was happening. But this was a time, the early 17th century, of a really, I don't know what you would call it. There was a kind of spiritual renaissance taking place in France in the early 17th century, and the Jesuits were a big part of that. They weren't the only ones leading this kind of revival, but they were affected by it. And people like Brebeuf and Jogues craved martyrdom. They prayed for it. They wrote about it. They asked for it. And then with the destruction of the mission and then the martyrdom of the 8 Jesuits, 6 priests, and 2 lay brothers, they became models for the next generation of Jesuit missionaries who worked in the region.
Yeah, my understanding too. I mean, today we have, again, as John suggests, a sort of ambivalent view of all this, but at the same time, they were fueled by this sense of saving souls. That was the conceptual framework that they really wanted to go out and not only promote the Christian faith or the Catholic faith, but also to save souls. And their belief was that without their coming, these would be lost.
And even in death, this is my friend and colleague from the University of Ottawa, Emma Anderson, has written, I think, the best book on this topic, called The Death and Afterlife of the North American Martyrs, published by Harvard, I believe. But even in death, they continued their work through the community. So before he died, people took Brebeuf's a vial of his blood just in case, because they wanted to have something.
A relic,
some sort of relic.
Yeah.
And then Jogues' skull is still available as a relic. It's been cut in half.
We should definitely do a show on relics, because
It's
it's such
a
an
very
inaccessible idea to modern people.
It's fascinating. So in the aftermath, there was a hospital nun, a very well-known hospital nun, who would take and grate bits of Jogues' bone into soup and other things that she was serving to her patients as a a method of healing.
Right, right. And this was very common, not only in the missions, but my work was on St. Francis de Sales, who died in 1622.
Yes.
And when he died, there was a huge rush. They had to protect his body so that people wouldn't be dismembering it. And actually his heart, which was kept in a reliquary at one of the communities in France during the French Revolution, was smuggled out into the Piedmont by a group of nuns, undercover, so that it wouldn't be touched, destroyed. So as a
Jogues lost his heart. I think it was cut out of him.
All right, so definitely we need to talk about relics at some point. I'm wondering though, just to kind of move toward wrapping up, when you talked about they craved martyrdom, in the early church, certainly that was always a red flag that you weren't supposed to crave martyrdom. That in a way that would disqualify you. It had to come your way. You couldn't actually go out and seek it. Now I'm sure that wasn't always the case, but are you aware, was that ever an issue in the deliberations leading up to their canonization?
I don't know if that was a part of the deliberations, because I think that they were beatified in 1925 and then canonized in 1930, although there was a long effort before that. I mean, even at the time of their deaths, there were people who were already collecting material, assuming that this would be a case at some time. The suppression of the Jesuits may have had something to do with the long delay in there, but I'm not sure. If you read their personal writings, they're very careful about locating their desires within the larger will of God. They're very careful about that. They don't. I mean, basically, they ask that they be able to give everything in service to God. So
which is a very
not
Ignatian
for their own
prayer.
glory. Yes, not
Right.
for their own personal glory, but to save souls. They'll often talk about if I will give my life if to save one person. That kind of thing.
Right. So it was a spirit of abandonment, of self-sacrifice, of commitment to the cause.
Yes.
And whatever the result.
Yeah, and I think the Jesuit model encouraged this, certainly in that time period, because they were supposed to go out into the world and be with people. They weren't supposed to stay in the monastery and pray and sing.
Right.
So I guess the last question then I would have is, thinking to the context of what you said, 1930s, they were canonized. Was this part of a general effort to canonize native saints in North America as a way of globalizing the church, or?
It was considered like an important step toward recognizing the work of Catholic figures in North America. And there are a lot of other things going on. There are 2 shrines today, two primary shrines. There's one in Midland, Ontario, which is also where the reconstructed mission is. And it's a really amazing place to visit. And then there's a shrine in Orisville, New York, which is at the site of the Jogues martyrdom, and also the site where St. Catherine Tekakwitha supposedly was born. And one of the things that Emma Anderson talks about in her book is that these figures become available for interpretation and reinterpretation for a lot of different reasons and in a lot of different ways. So the Orisville Shrine is actually the center of a very conservative Catholic pilgrimage every year. And the people that participate in this pilgrimage seem to identify with these figures as people who were willing to give everything for the truth and not bend to the will of what was popular.
Secularism or something like that.
Yes.
Right. Okay. This has been a really interesting conversation with Dr. Tracy Leavelle, who is of the History Department here and Associate Dean of Humanities and Fine Arts as well, about two of the memorialized North American Jesuit martyrs. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And this has been Catholic Comments from Creighton University.